For decades, the Philippines has wrapped its economic policies in the flag. You know, building walls in the name of nationalism to supposedly protect Filipino interests. But what if that whole story was a cover-up? What if the real goal was never protection, but plunder? The source material we're diving into today puts forward a really provocative idea that for the better part of a century, the country was basically hurting itself on purpose, economically speaking, all while calling it patriotism. And get this, it argues this wasn't some kind of mistake, it was a deliberate strategy.
And that really boils it all down to this one huge question, doesn't it? Were all those protectionist laws a noble effort to lift up the nation, or were they just a really sophisticated way to steal opportunity from the many and give it to a select few?
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at what the article calls the Great Economic Con, then the weapons of exclusion they used. After that, a really surprising accidental experiment that changed everything. We'll see why the walls are still up, how to tear them down, and finally, the choice the country faces for its future.
So, the main argument from the source is this. That whole wave of economic nationalism back in the 50s and 60s, the one that went after Chinese merchants, it was never actually about helping ordinary Filipinos. It was a smokescreen used by the country's elite, the oligarchs, to protect their own businesses from some seriously tough and successful competition.
So you might be asking, how did they even pull this off? Well, it wasn't just with speeches. They had some pretty powerful tools at their disposal. Let's call them what the article implies they are: weapons of exclusion, used to build these economic walls.
And the first big weapon in their arsenal was the Retail Trade Nationalization Law. Now, on the surface, it sounded simple, even patriotic. The idea was that all retail businesses would be reserved only for Filipino citizens. No foreigners allowed. Sounds good, right?
Well, here's the catch, the gap between the promise and the reality. The law promised to empower Filipinos, but the article argues it did the exact opposite. By kicking out experienced merchants, it didn't lift up the small Filipino shop owner. No, it just handed a protected, competition-free market to the wealthy elite who already had all the money and connections.
Okay, so weapon number one was locking down retail. Weapon number two? It was making it almost impossible for the people they were targeting, these Chinese residents, to become Filipino citizens in the first place. They created this bureaucratic fortress.
And when I say fortress, I mean it. Look at this gauntlet. You needed to live there for a long time, prove you had a high income, find character witnesses, and go through public hearings and court proceedings that cost more than most families made in years. It wasn't a pathway to citizenship, it was a wall designed to keep productive people out.
But here's the thing about capital and talent. They're like water. They always find a way around barriers. So, barred from retail, these entrepreneurs just pivoted. They moved into other areas like wholesaling and manufacturing and found clever workarounds. And that just proved the point, right? The barriers themselves were totally artificial.
And all of this, the weapons, the workarounds, it all fits into this much bigger picture. This chart from the article is actually pretty incredible. It's like the whole blueprint of the con laid out in one image. You can see the tools of exclusion, how capital adapted, the proposed solution, and what's really at stake.
And now we get to the biggest plot twist of all. According to the source, the one person who accidentally proved this entire protectionist model was dead wrong was none other than the dictator Ferdinand Marcos.
See, in the 1970s, Marcos issued decrees that just simplified everything, allowing for the mass naturalization of thousands of longtime Chinese residents. He basically brought them into the formal economy. And just like that, the so-called Chinese problem that had fueled decades of policy didn't end with exclusion, it ended with integration.
So what happened? Did the sky fall? Did the economy implode? Nope. The article argues this event proved the exact opposite of what the nationalists have been claiming for decades, that these artificial barriers don't protect an economy, they actually make it weaker.
So this begs a pretty obvious question, right? If a dictator accidentally proved that openness works more than 40 years ago, why are so many of these walls still standing today? Let's take a look at the modern barriers to prosperity.
The article points to some really deep structural problems. First, there are barriers baked right into the Constitution, like the famous 60-40 rule on foreign ownership. Then you have a system where all the power is concentrated in Manila, which kind of chokes out the rest of the country. And top of it all, a presidential system that seems almost designed for political gridlock, making big reforms nearly impossible.
But the source doesn't just point out all the problems.
It actually proposes a pretty radical three-part solution for tearing down these walls once and for all. And we're not talking about small tweaks here.
Pillar number 1 is a real commitment to free markets. That means going into the Constitution and scrapping things like the 60-40 rule. Basically, stop treating foreign investment like a threat and start treating it like fuel for development.
Pillar number 2 is federalism. The idea here is to break Manila's chokehold on power. Let different regions compete with each other to attract investment. So if Cebu can offer better regulations than Manila, capital and talent will flow there. It creates this healthy competition that drives reform from the ground up.
And the third pillar is a shift to a parliamentary system. Instead of a system where the executive and legislature are always at war, a parliamentary government can actually pass the big laws it proposes. It's designed for action, not gridlock, which is exactly what you need for major reforms.
So all of this leads to a final, pretty stark choice. The article frames the future not as something that will just happen, but as a conscious decision between two fundamentally different paths.
And this lays out that choice perfectly. One path is the status quo, an economy that exports its best people, run by an oligarchy where who you know is more important than what you know. The other path is about competing globally, building an economy based on merit and rewarding people who actually create things.
The source leaves us with this final searing question. Marcos, of all people, stumbled upon the truth that letting people in works better than keeping them out. The question now is whether today's leaders are willing to learn that same lesson.
So the final message isn't a suggestion, it's a demand. The argument is that the barriers built to strangle competition decades ago are now strangling the entire country. The call to action is to tear them down. Not someday, now.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We need to start today by asking a question that is probably going to make you a little uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah.
It certainly made me pause when I was reading through the research. I mean, we usually think of nationalism or patriotism as good things.
Of course. Buying local, protecting our own.
Exactly. But the question the source material poses is this. What if the economic policies sold to the Philippine public as patriotic for the last 70 years were actually a con job?
It is a heavy one today.
Yep.
And con job is a strong phrase, but it really does capture the essence of the argument in the paper we're looking at.
Oh, what's it called?
It's titled, Philippine Anti-Chinese Business Laws. We Built a Nation on Economic Self-Harm.
Economic self-harm. Wow. That really sets the tone, doesn't it?
It does.
It implies we did this to ourselves.
Pretty much. The core thesis here is that the so-called Chinese problem in the Philippines,
Right.
the one that justified decades of these incredibly restrictive laws. The author argues it was never really about protecting the average Filipino, not the person on the street or in the barrio.
So it was a smokescreen.
The smokescreen. The real goal, the text says, was to create what it calls a cartelized playground for the elite.
So their argument is that by framing exclusion as patriotism, the political elite weren't protecting the country at all. They were just protecting their own market share.
Exactly. And to prove this, the source takes us on this whole journey from the 1950s all the way to a proposed future. We're going to look at the specific laws, the weapons of exclusion, and, how they backfired.
Okay.
We'll look at how the Philippines fell behind its neighbors, like Singapore and Taiwan. And finally, we have to talk about the solution the source proposes.
Which involves what?
It implies tearing up the current political structure entirely. We're talking federalism and a parliamentary system.
Whoa. Okay, those are massive topics. But before we get to the solution, we have to understand the trap. So let's go back. 1950s. Post-war Philippines. The source calls this the birth of weapons of exclusion. What was the weapon?
The main weapon was the Retail Trade Nationalization Law of 1954. That's Republic Act 1180.
Okay, nationalization. Just to be clear, that doesn't mean the government taking over industries like in a communist state.
No, not at all. It means Filipinization.
Right, Filipinos only. And on cheaper, if you're a listener in 1954, that sounds pretty noble. The economy is recovering, and the government says, we're going to keep the retail sector for our own people.
Keep the aliens out, let the locals thrive. That was the rhetoric. It was wrapped in the flag.
And it even held up in court, right?
It did. The source details how this law was challenged, went all the way to the Supreme Court in a case called Ichong v. Hernandez, and the court blessed it.
They said it was legal.
Yep, called it a legitimate exercise of police power and economic nationalism. The whole narrative was that the state needed to protect the small Filipino merchant from the so-called alien control of retail.
Alien control being the Chinese merchants.
Correct. But this deep dive asks us to stop looking at the rhetoric and look at the mechanics. Who actually benefited from banning Chinese merchants from retail?
And the source says?
The text argues it wasn't the sorry store owner. It was the families who already had capital, the elite who controlled import licenses, land titles, and, legislative favors.
Okay, help me understand the mechanism there. How does banning a Chinese shopkeeper actually help a Filipino oligarch?
Well, think about the supply chain. If you wipe out your competition in the middle, the retailers, you disrupt the market.
Right.
But the bigger thing is that this mindset of exclusion allowed the elite to capture the regulatory agencies. If you limit who can play the game, the people who make the rules become the most powerful players. The source calls this theft of opportunity.
So by clearing the field, they weren't helping the little guy. They were just handing the big guys a monopoly.
Exactly. Because when you remove competition, you stop innovating, don't you?
Right. You create a protected sector where competition is illegal. Prices can be controlled. Service doesn't have to improve because the customer has nowhere else to go.
Precisely.
Now, there's a logical question here that I'm sure you're thinking and the listener is thinking. If these Chinese merchants wanted to stay in business, why didn't they just become citizens?
Right. If the law applies to aliens, then just stop being an alien.
Exactly. Wouldn't that solve the problem?
And that is the crucial question. This is where the source details what it calls the naturalization maze. The system, it argues, was rigged to make sure they couldn't become citizens.
And the source points to a specific law for this.
Yes. Commonwealth Act, Num 473. This act was the gatekeeper, and the gate was basically the eye of a needle.
What did you have to do?
To become a citizen, you faced income tests that were incredibly high for the time. You needed character witnesses. There were public hearings where anyone could object. The judicial proceedings alone cost more than most families earned in years.
So it was a rich man's game.
And even for the rich, it was hard. There was a quota.
A quota.
Only 50 Chinese immigrants per year.
Wait, 50? As in 50?
50. For the entire country. The source argues this proves the intent wasn't about maintaining standards of citizenship. It was about maintaining scarcity.
Maintaining scarcity, that's a powerful phrase.
It implies that the goal was just to prevent merit-based competition. I mean, if you let them become citizens, they compete on equal footing as Filipinos. They have rights.
But if you keep them as aliens, even if they were born in Manila and spoke Tagalog...
You can legislate them out of business anytime you want. You keep them legally precarious.
So you have these walls built up, restrictive laws, impossible citizenship paths. But here's the thing about economics, and the source makes a big point of this. Money and business, they tend to find a way, don't they?
It's like physics. The source uses this visual of water around stones. You can put a rock in the river, but the water doesn't stop. It just flows around it.
So what did the water do in the 1950s and 60s? How did they get around it?
It adapted. The capital didn't just vanish. The merchants didn't all leave. The source lists the methods. First, the dummy system.
Which is a term we still hear today.
Oh yeah, a dummy or a front. A Chinese businessman provides the capital, runs the shop, but the paperwork lists a Filipino owner who just gets a fee for using their name.
Which sounds like a workaround, but the source argues this had a really toxic effect on the culture.
It was poisonous. I mean, think about it. You are forcing the most productive part of your economy to operate illegally. You're basing business on deception, not contract law.
And if your business partner steals from you, you can't go to court.
You can't. Because the business technically isn't yours. It just creates this breeding ground for blackmail and corruption.
And what was the other workaround?
Moving up the supply chain. Since they were banned from retail, from the storefront, they moved into wholesaling and manufacturing. They started to control the supply to the storefront.
So the law actually backfired. It pushed them into bigger, more powerful positions.
In many ways, yes. But the broader consequence, according to the text, was the birth of this huge gray economy.
Where the most successful skill.
It wasn't innovation or marketing or customer service. It was evading nationalist policy.
That's a damning statement. The skill set shifted from value creation to evasion.
And the source argues we are still living with the hangover of that culture today. This normalization of the idea that to succeed in business, you have to bypass the law and not follow it.
Okay, so this brings us to what I think is the biggest plot twist in this whole document.
Oh yeah, The Marcos irony.
Right, because you think of Ferdinand and Marcos in a very specific way, strongman, nationalist, Filipino first. But the source credits him with an accidental stroke of genius on this specific issue.
It is the Marcos irony. The source highlights that in the mid-1970s, Marcos issued Presidential Decree 836 and Letter of Instruction 270.
Alphabet soup. What did those actually do?
They facilitated mass naturalization. He basically opened the gates that had been closed for decades. He made it easier, cheaper, and faster for Chinese residents to become Filipino citizens.
Why? I mean, was he suddenly a liberal reformer?
The source suggests it was just pragmatic. He wanted to secure diplomatic ties with the newly opening People's Republic of China, and he wanted to bring all that capital into the formal system so he could tax it and control it. But the intent that matters less than the result.
And what was the result? Because, I mean, if you believed the hype from the 1950s,
right,
letting all these aliens become citizens, that should have just destroyed the Filipino merchant, shouldn't it?
That was the fear, 100%. But the aha moment here is that it didn't happen. The economy didn't collapse. Filipino retailers weren't wiped out. The Chinese problem effectively ended because the state stopped excluding them. They were integrated. They became Filipino citizens, they paid taxes, and their businesses became Filipino businesses.
The source has a great line about this. Marcos accidentally proved that liberalization works.
And the follow-up to that line is the real kicker.
Which is?
Then we learned nothing.
And that's the frustrating part of this deep dive. You have this proof of concept right there. Inclusion worked. But the source argues that after Marcos, post-ADSA, instead of embracing that lesson, the country doubled down on protectionism in a different way.
It moves from the retail trade law to the Constitution itself. The source compares the Philippines to its neighbors, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea.
We all started in roughly the same place in the mid-20th century. In fact, the Philippines was ahead of most of them.
Way ahead. And now, it's not even close.
Not even in the same league.
And the comparison is stark. Those countries, and even China later on, they grew by opening up. They aggressively courted foreign investment. They said, come build your factories here, bring your technology here.
And the Philippines said,
keep out. Or more specifically, you can come in, but only if you're a junior partner. And this is the famous or infamous 60-40 equity requirement.
Which is in the 1987 Constitution.
That's a little...
We hear 60-40 all the time in the business news. Can we just break down what that means for our listener who isn't a corporate lawyer?
Sure. It means that for many key industries, public utilities, land ownership, natural resources, a foreign investor cannot own more than 40% of the company. Filipinos must own at least 60%.
So if I'm a massive tech company from Japan and I want to build a $1 billion power plant in the Philippines to lower electricity costs,
you can't just do it. You have to find a local partner to put up 60% of the money, or at least own 60% of the shares. And the source asks, who has that kind of money?
The oligarchs.
Exactly. It forces foreign capital to partner with the local elite. It's like a toll gate. The source argues this treats foreign capital as a colonial threat instead of a tool for development.
It's that scarcity mindset all over again. But doesn't this partnership, help the local partner learn the ropes?
Sometimes, maybe, but often it just scares the investor away. The source argues the result is we stayed poor while our neighbors got rich. Because capital goes where it's welcome.
Of course.
If Vietnam allows 100% ownership and control, and the Philippines requires a forced marriage with a local partner, where do you think the factory goes?
It goes to Vietnam. And we see that happening in real time.
And the mechanism described is that these restrictions create an environment where business success depends more on lobbying Congress than on actually serving customers.
You're not competing on quality, you're competing on connections.
Right. You create a small pond where the big fish can dominate without any fear of outside competition.
So we've diagnosed the problem. The source argues we built this whole system of self-harm based on a false idea of nationalism. Now, let's talk about the cure. The deep dive outlines the real solution, and it's not small tweaks, is it? It's a 3-pillar overhaul.
Yeah, this is where the source really shifts from history to advocacy. The first pillar is, maybe unsurprisingly, free markets.
Which means demolishing that 60-40 rule.
Yes. The argument is to welcome investment from anywhere: China, the US, Japan, Europe. Shift the metric from who you know or what passport you hold to what you can do. Let the best ideas and capital compete.
But the source goes further. It argues you can't just change the economic laws, you have to change the political container they sit in. This brings us to the second pillar: federalism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is a trigger word for a lot of people. It's very political. Why does an economic paper link federalism to economic freedom?
It calls it breaking the Manila chokehold. The idea is that the current unitary system concentrates all decision-making power in the capital. Manila decides the budget, the rules, the priorities.
Which works if you live in Manila, not so much if you're in Mindanao or the Visayas.
Exactly. This one-size-fits-all approach stifles the provinces. Under federalism, a place like Cebu or Davao could write its own economic rules, at least to a certain extent.
So they could become like laboratories.
That's the exact term used. Laboratories of reform. Imagine if Cebu decided, we are going to lower corporate taxes and streamline business permits to be the easiest place in Asia to start a company.
Investors would flock there.
And then what happens? Manila and other regions, they have to compete. They have to match that efficiency or they lose out.
So it creates competition between regions.
And that competition forces the whole country to improve. Right now, there's no competition because everyone just follows the same sluggish national policy.
That actually makes a lot of sense. It's applying the free market concept to governance itself.
Right.
Now, the third pillar is a parliamentary system. Again, this feels like political science class, but what is the economic argument?
It's all about speed and accountability. The source contends that the current presidential system is just designed for gridlock. You have the executive, the president, and the legislative Congress constantly fighting.
We see that every single budget season.
Right. Reform often dies in committee or gets watered down to nothing. In a parliamentary system, the executive and legislative powers are fused. The prime minister and the cabinet are members of parliament.
So the government that proposes the reform is the same one that votes on it.
So if you need to pass a law to open up the economy, you can actually do it. And you can do it fast. But here's the key accountability part.
Okay.
If the government screws up, or if the economy tanks, they can be replaced immediately through a vote of no confidence.
You don't have to wait 6 years while the country stagnates.
Exactly. The source describes the current constitution as a monument to 1987's economic anxieties and argues the presidential system is just too rigid for the modern world.
So the tripod is open the markets, decentralize power, and streamline governance.
Yes. The source frames this as building a system where change is possible.
We are coming to the end of our deep dive, and I want to look at the stakes, because this isn't just theoretical. The source presents a binary choice for the future. Stay poor or build prosperity.
It's a very stark choice in the text. Option A is the status quo. And, well, we know what that looks like. You continue to export talent.
The brain drain.
And the source argues the brain drain isn't an accident. It's a feature of the oligarch economy. I mean, think about it. If the markets are closed, if foreign companies can't come in and build HQs here, there are just fewer high-quality jobs.
So the nurse, the engineer, the IT specialist, they have to leave to find a market that actually values their skills.
Exactly. We export our people because we refuse to import capital. That's the trade-off we've made.
That is a heartbreaking way to put it. We export people because we refuse to import capital.
And option B is reform. Compete globally. Build a merit-based economy where you keep that talent at home because they can actually build wealth here.
There's a question near the end of the text that really hit me. It asks, are we really going to be dumber than a dictator?
It's provocative, for sure, but it refers to that lesson from Marcos. We have historical proof right here in our own history that inclusion works better than exclusion, yet the laws remain.
And the source says the current system is teaching the next generation the wrong lesson.
The wrong lesson entirely. That success requires political connections, not merit. And as long as that's the lesson, the best and brightest will pack their bags.
It really paints a picture of this generational cycle. We claim these laws protect us, but they actually just limit us.
It goes right back to that con job idea we started with. If you tell people that foreign investment is a threat, a second invasion, they will applaud you for blocking it. It feels good. It feels patriotic.
But the reality on the ground is different.
Completely. If you explain that blocking it means fewer jobs, lower wages, and higher prices, and that the only people benefiting are the local tycoons who don't want to upgrade their services, the applause would stop very quickly.
So what does this all mean for you, listening right now? The source contends that true nationalism isn't about closing doors. It's not about being afraid that a foreign company will come in and outperform us.
True nationalism, according to this analysis, is confidence. It's believing that Filipinos are smart enough, creative enough, and hardworking enough to compete on a global stage without needing some kind of government handicap.
It's about confidence versus fear.
Precise.
And I want to leave you with the final provocative thought from the source. It challenges us to stop living in a charade. We need to ask ourselves, do we continue to pretend that these protectionist laws protect the poor, or do we finally admit they are oligarch protection and tear them down?
And that's a question that requires looking at economic news very differently. When you see a headline about protecting local industries, you have to ask yourself, which specific Filipinos are being protected? Is it the consumer, the worker, or is it the owner who just doesn't want any competition?
It's a deep dive that definitely challenges the standard narrative of Philippine history. We hope this gives you a new lens to view the economy. Thanks for listening, and keep questioning the obvious truths.
Until next time.